Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. In our previous lecture, we concluded discussion on the determination of equilibrium, income and employment in a Keynesian setup. We looked at concepts of the multiplier, the accelerator, and how they interacted. And then we were able to start discussion on unemployment. That is the first of the four major problems that we will be covering in this course, with the other three problems being inflation, growth, and balance of payments problems. Now, most people find the discussion of the problems in macroeconomics a far more interesting part of the course than when you're discussing things like how the equilibrium output and income is determined. The reason being that it is easier to identify with problems that you see around you. So it's easier to think about and talk about inflation, unemployment, trade deficit problems, growth problems, because this is what the headlines are talking about. Very rarely would you find the headlines talking about how the equilibrium level of output is determined, because that's quite a theoretical exercise, but critically important to developing an overall view of the macroeconomy. Well, that said, we are talking about the problems that are faced in any macroeconomy, could be faced in any macroeconomy. So if most of you enjoy this part of the course. It's quite interesting. It will get harder once we get to discussing balance of payments problems, and thereafter when we introduce the monetary sector. But right now, the next 2-3 lectures are going to be quite a lot of fun. If you remember, in the previous lecture, we introduced the measurement and meaning of unemployment. We defined unemployment as the ratio of the number of unemployed people in the total labor force divided by the size of the total labor force. It was not the total number of people that were not employed, right? We made some exclusions. We excluded children from there. Children are not supposed to work. They're supposed to go to school. We excluded parents who were bringing up children. We excluded people who were terminally ill or incapacitated or very old people. Those people should not be included in the denominator when you're trying to develop a ratio for or a rate for the unemployment problem. Now, once we have an unemployment ratio, that is the ratio of the number of unemployed divided by the labor force, it is easy to compare the degree of the problem of unemployment across countries. So you can then say, yes, unemployment in Pakistan is 15%, unemployment in the neighboring Afghanistan is, let's say, 20%, unemployment in the UK is 7%, things like that. So it makes sense to compare ratios. Otherwise, if you were just talking about numbers, then that would not give us an idea of how serious the problem is. So, for example, the unemployment numbers in Pakistan might be much higher than they are, let's say, in Afghanistan or the UK. But if you take as a percentage of the size of the labor force, then the problem might appear to be much less. So it's really the scaled measure, that is the ratio measure of unemployment, which serves as the benchmark for comparison. Now, 3 qualifications that I want to talk about this measure of unemployment that we have developed. The first is about underemployment. That is, it is possible for this measure to give you an understated level of or understated picture of the unemployment problem. So, for example, in reality, it is possible for people to be sort of appear as being employed in any firm, business, or government, but they might not be working to the full potential. So maybe there are people who want to work full-time, but they are only given part-time jobs, right? So in this case, the unemployment ratio would still treat them, the unemployment, when you're calculating the unemployment ratio, a person who is working part-time would still categorize as a person who is employed. You would not call him unemployed, because he is obviously working part-time. But there is an element of underemployment in this, because that person is not being employed to the level or degree that he wishes to be employed. So that in that sense, the unemployment ratio might understate the degree or the intensity of the unemployment problem. Now, it is also possible for unemployment to be disguised. We talked about underemployment, but it is also possible for people to be apparently employed but not having anything to do. So, right, you usually come across people who are working in government offices or other offices who are not really doing anything. They are paid salaries, they get incomes, but they are not actively involved in any job. They just go to the office, report there, and then come back. And this is often the case in many lower income countries which have large public sector enterprises or a large public sector in general. So this is the case of disguised unemployment. That is, the people are actually unemployed. There is not enough work to do for those people, but they are being paid salaries by the government or by different firms. So those two things, underemployment and the disguised nature of unemployment, might actually understate the problem of unemployment. So if you just look at the unemployment ratio, and let's say it's 20%, you might conclude that the problem is, well, quite serious, but it might actually be more serious if you include the degree of underemployment or the people who are employed but not really doing any job, that is disguised unemployment. It is also possible for the unemployment ratio to overstate the problem. What do you mean when you say overstate the problem? Well, typically, the unemployment problem is related to scarcity of jobs relative to the number of people who want to work. So if jobs are few and the people are many, then typically you will say that there is an unemployment problem. So when can an unemployment ratio give you a misleading picture of the unemployment problem? That is, when can it overstate the problem? Now think about a lower income country like Pakistan or any other country where there's a lot of child labor, right? Now children, because they are not allowed to work legally, will not enter the formal statistics of employment, right? But there are those jobs that those children are doing, and many children unfortunately are involved in child labor. So what happens is that those jobs that the children are doing are not offered to people who are actually out there looking for some of those jobs. Children are often cheaper to employ, they have very little rights, people abuse their energies, and therefore it is possible for certain eligible people for those jobs to be not considered and children to be considered in their place. But this will overstate the problem when you're talking about the unemployment rate, because a lot of the people who are now unemployed did have jobs, but only that those jobs were taken by children or were given to children or child labor. So this is one way in which the problem could be, the ratio could overstate the problem. It might be that there are enough jobs in the economy. Similarly, if any one person is doing more than one job, so if a person goes and works in an office in the morning and then goes and works somewhere else at night, doctors often do that. They go and serve in hospitals, government hospitals in the mornings, and then in the evenings they go to private hospitals and have their practice there. So they're actually doing two jobs, right? They're doing a 9-to-5 job in the morning, and then they're also doing, let's say, a 6 to 10 job in the evening. So if one person is doing two jobs, then there are actually two jobs in the economy. It's only that the same person is doing those two jobs. So when you say that the unemployment problem is quite severe, it might not actually be so severe. That is, there are enough jobs out there. It's just that the jobs are in the hands of a few people. That is, the same person is doing multiple jobs. Also, it is possible for people to have different skills, right? That there are jobs out there, but the people who want to work do not have the right skills for those jobs. So again, this could, if this is not taken into account, then a simple look at the unemployment ratio might mislead you or lead you to overstate or overestimate the problem. Now, there is also a fourth reason why a simple look at the unemployment ratio might lead you to overstate the problem of unemployment. You note that unemployment or the unemployed are basically those people who are a part of the labor force, that is, who are able to work, right, that they should be actually or ideally be employed, but who are not working, that is, who do not have jobs. Now, this is probably not a problem in our country. I will give you a way in which you can conceptualize this in the context of developing countries. But if you look at advanced countries, many of these countries have social safety nets. That is, if a person does not have employment, he is paid an unemployment benefit, a monthly allowance to help him live or help him survive, right? And there are often many people who can actually work, but who prefer to live on this unemployment benefit because they are getting free money, they like to just relax, they are lazy, they don't want to work, right? So those people, while they will also be included in the unemployed pool, technically they are not unemployed because they really aren't making the effort to find jobs and work. They are sort of voluntarily unemployed. So when you actually look at the statistics and you say, ooh, there are so many people unemployed, part of the people who are unemployed might not actually want to work. They're just sitting there getting the unemployment benefit. Now, the equivalent example of that in lower income countries where unemployment benefits are not so common would be that of beggary. Beggary is institutionalized in many poor countries. So a beggar might prefer to go around begging with his bowl in his hand and prefer that to actually going out and working hard, because he can actually get either more money like this, or he prefers to be lazy or whatever. So when you have this kind of a situation, any number, any measure of unemployment might lead you to overstate the problem. Next, we look at the other qualification, that is regarding the duration of unemployment. Now, when you say that 25% of the people are unemployed, it does not give you an idea as to how long those 25% of people have been unemployed. Whether they've been unemployed for a year, whether they've been unemployed for a day. It might be that tomorrow, if you calculated the unemployment rate, it might be down to 20% or 15%. That is, if there are suddenly a flood of new jobs and a flood of new hirings, then the number of unemployed people might go down drastically, right? So duration of unemployment is an important concept as well, and needs to be qualified. So whenever you talk about the unemployment rate, make sure that you have some idea of what the average duration of unemployment is for a person who is unemployed. In order to develop a better understanding of how long an unemployment spell can last, you need to look at the rates of inflows and outflows from unemployment. That you need to look at the rate at which people are becoming unemployed and the rate at which people are becoming employed or sort of getting jobs. It is the difference in those rates which will determine the average duration of an unemployment spell. Let's look at a nice diagram which summarizes the inflows and outflows from the unemployment pool in the context of a simple economy. Let's go to our first slide. Now, this diagram is very similar to the injection and leakage diagram that we studied earlier, only that it is presented here as a pool, a swimming pool, which has two entry pipes and two exit pipes. That is two injection pipes and two leakage pipes. The pool is the pool of unemployed people. There are two ways that people can become unemployed, right? So they can either be fired, that is, they could be people who were originally on jobs but who were now made redundant. That is, the firm said, we don't need you anymore. There could be people who are sacked, that is, who are sort of simply sent home, sent packing. There are people who might resign themselves voluntarily. So it's not the firm which fires them, but it's the person who himself or herself takes leave. There are also then people who are temporarily laid off, that they might be suspended for some future hiring. Now, all these people will enter the unemployment pool. It is also possible to enter the unemployment pool from outside the labor force. So think of school, college leavers, students who have just completed college or university. Now, as soon as they finish college and university, they will sort of become a part of the labor force, and they will become a part of the unemployed. Then it depends on when they get the job that they will exit that pool. So that's one category. Then it could be that people returning to the labor force after raising children. Some mothers, as you know, who are educated and who want to work, cannot do so because their children are very small. This is a typical example in the modern world. And so once their children have grown up, some of these mothers might want to return to working, and therefore once they offer themselves for work, they also become a part of the labor force, and therefore they can be formally recognized as unemployed people. Now people also leave the unemployed pool, and they can leave it again to either jobs or to outside the labor force. Now when people leave the unemployment pool to join new jobs, there could be all sorts of people in this group. There could be people who have just completed their school. There could be people who are just sort of switching jobs. They might have been laid off and they are now taking on new jobs. It might include parents or mothers who are now offering themselves for work. So all categories of people could be included here. It is also possible for people to exit the unemployment pool and go back to jobs who had been temporarily laid off or suspended. Finally, it is possible for people to exit the unemployment pool by going to outside the labor force. And these would include people who have become disheartened and give up looking for a job, people who have reached retirement age, people who temporarily withdraw from the labor force, that is example to raise a family, people who migrate to outside the city or to a different city or country, and people who simply die. Now, having developed those qualifications regarding the statistical measure we proposed, that is dividing the number of unemployed people by the size of the labor force, that is by discussing the effects of underemployment, disguised unemployment, and duration of unemployment, we can now move to a discussion of what the costs of unemployment are. Why should we worry about unemployment, right? Why is unemployment a problem? There are certainly costs to unemployment. And some of you might say, well, this is such an obvious question. Nobody wants to be unemployed. Unemployment obviously has costs in terms of loss of income, and one doesn't feel too good, etc., etc. But let's try to formalize those costs, because I think it is useful as an exercise. In order to do that, we need to divide unemployed people into two categories. The first category would be those who are voluntarily unemployed, that is, who are unemployed because they don't want to work, and then there are people who are involuntarily unemployed. And note that we introduced these categories in our discussion of Introductory Macroeconomics, Introduction to Macroeconomics, the first 3 lectures, when we were comparing the Keynesian and the classical view on unemployment. Now, what are the costs of unemployment to a person who is voluntarily unemployed? Do we need to worry about those costs? Well, not at the individual level. If a person is receiving unemployment benefit, or if a person just likes to relax and spend his time watching television, doesn't want to work, if there is a person who is addicted to beggary or something like that and is lazy, doesn't want to work, then those people are not really a point of concern or an object of concern for policymakers, because those people have chosen to remain unemployed. That is, their private costs or marginal private cost of unemployment is less than the marginal private benefit that they derive from unemployment, right? That they derive from the consumption of leisure, etc., etc. So that's one. But again, as we noted earlier, there is a distinction between marginal private costs and benefits and marginal social costs and benefits. And it is quite possible that while the individual person who chooses to remain unemployed is quite happy, that the very fact that he is unemployed has negative implications for society as a whole. That is, the marginal social costs of his being unemployed exceed the marginal social benefits. So what would be the social costs of a person who is unemployed voluntarily? Think about it. when a person is unemployed, it's a resource wasted, right? That person is not making use of the the faculties or the energies that God Almighty has given him or her. So when he chooses or she chooses to be unemployed, they don't become a part of the productive members of society, the productive forces of society. That is, the society as a whole will be able to produce less goods and services, be able to achieve a level of activity which is less than what it could potentially achieve. So there is obviously the cost associated with that. Then once the income level of these people falls, because they are unemployed, they are not really earning any income. And because they are not earning any income, then the government can't collect any income taxes from them, right? Income taxes can only be collected from people who are earning some incomes. So that's a cost as well for government, that the government can't collect income taxes from these people who are voluntarily unemployed. Also think about firms. Firms will lose out in general if people are not working, because if people are not working, then firms obviously can't produce the amount of output that they could otherwise produce if those people offered themselves for working. So if firms wanted to produce more and they were looking for laborers, but all these laborers were not offering themselves to work, that they were voluntarily unemployed, then firms wouldn't be able to sell those additional units of output and make the extra profit on that. Also note that when the overall level of activity in the society falls because of these unemployed people, the other workers who are already employed also suffer because of that. You know, generally when the economy is growing and there is a boom, everybody in the economy gains. And generally if the economy is performing below its full potential, then everybody in the economy suffers. So even those people who are employed, who are working, suffer because the economy is not working at its full potential, because the level of the income of the economy, the equilibrium level of output, is not equal to the full employment or a higher level of output. Now, what would be the costs to society if a person was involuntarily unemployed? That is, he wanted to work or she wanted to work but could not find employment. Now, in this particular case, all the costs that were incurred when the person was voluntarily unemployed would still hold. That is, all those costs about lower income taxes that the government could collect, the lower level of output in the economy, etc., would still hold. But now there would be added costs, and these added costs would be private costs. That is, the mental torture that the person goes through by being not employed, right? It does not do wonders for your self-esteem if you are unemployed and if you can't find a job. And that can often hurt people's relationships in their households, in their families. Often relationships between husband and wife can break up because one of them can't find employment. Similarly, if there are a lot of involuntarily unemployed people who are quite frustrated and angry at the fact that they can't find employment, the general level of crime and violence and vandalism in the society could go up. And all these factors lead to negative effects for the society as a whole. So this is how costs incurred at the private level translate into overall costs for society. Now, given that discussion on the costs of unemployment, given that we've now concluded that brief discussion, we can now look at the causes of unemployment or theories about the causes of unemployment. So we started by looking at the measurement and meaning of unemployment. We looked at the costs of unemployment. So now we move to the causes of unemployment, and there are essentially three views on what the major causes of unemployment are. The three views are the monetarist view, the Keynesian view, and the classical view. Some people define the views in different sort of categories. Some people say there is the view that unemployment is caused voluntarily, it is caused involuntarily. There are other views as if unemployment is caused equilibrium unemployment because of an equilibrium instability or deficiencies, or it is called by disequilibrium phenomena. So there are various distinctions or categorizations of this problem that you will find in different textbooks. However, to my mind, the three major views on unemployment are best studied as the monetarist view, the Keynesian view, and the classical view. Now, you are already familiar with the Keynesian and classical views. We will address them, of course, again to refresh your memory. Let's take a look at the monetarist view, which most of you might not be familiar with. Now, in order to understand the distinctions between these three views, we need to develop some graphical foundations. Again, we need to set up the market, the labor market, the demand for labor, the supply for labor, and analyze how different views on what happens and what factors are causing which type of unemployment can be analyzed. So let's start by developing a graphical model for the labor market and see how these three contrasting views on unemployment can be developed in that context. Let's go to our series of graphs for today. Now, as you can see, here we have real wages, that is the real price of labor on the vertical axis. As you know, real basically means adjusted for the increase in prices or adjusted for inflation. So we are talking about the real cost of labor. That's shown on the vertical axis, and we have the number of workers on the horizontal axis. So this is similar to the price quantity graph that we draw in any market. Now, as you can see, the labor force curve is drawn as an upward sloping supply curve for labor, and it's quite inelastic, it's quite vertical. And the reason for that is that the labor supply or the labor force size can be considered fairly fixed in the short term. That is, even if you increase the real wages, it's unlikely that the size of the labor force will expand very much. However, at higher wages, some more people enter, but not a lot. Therefore, the LF curve is pretty vertical. The labor demand curve is the typical downward sloping demand curve. Now, the problem with using that graph, that is using the LF curve and the LD curve in order to understand where equilibrium employment or unemployment would exist and what the equilibrium wage rate would be. The main problem with that is that not all the people on the labor force are actually also willing to accept jobs. Fine, they are on the labor force, they have the ability to work, but some of the people on the labor force might not want to accept certain jobs. So they might want to remain unemployed for a while until they get a better job. So it is possible for people on the labor force to be not actually employed, that is to be not equal to the supply of labor, and when you talk about the actual willingness to accept jobs. So we need to differentiate between two curves here. One is the labor force curve, which is the total size of the labor force, and the other is the AJ curve, that is the accept jobs curve. And this curve would be a curve which is inwards, which is sort of to the left of the LF curve, meaning that the accept jobs category is a subset of the labor force category at all levels of wages. And the basic intuition or argument here is that there will be a subset of the total labor force that will at any time be willing to accept certain jobs. So that is the effective labor supply that we need to talk about. And it is the intersection of the AJ curve with the LD curve which should help us determine the level of employment in the economy. Let's go back to our graph and see how this difference between LF and AJ plays out. Now, as you can see in the earlier graph, we had equilibrium at N star and W star. But once you introduce this AJ curve, and note that the AJ curve is slightly more elastic than the LF curve, and this is because it is more likely that people will switch from being in the labor force and also becoming in a position where they accept jobs rather than people who are outside the labor force and becoming a part of the labor force. Therefore, the AJ curve is slightly more elastic than the LF curve. Note that the equilibrium now will be the point E, that is where the number of workers employed is N1 and the wage rate is W1. This is below the N star level of full equilibrium, Note that the N1 amount of workers who are employed is less than N star, where N star is the number of workers who would be on the labor force corresponding to the wage rate W1. So EF, that is the horizontal distance between the AJ and the LF curves at the going wage rate W1, measures the size of the natural rate of unemployment. EF, that is the difference between N star minus N1, N star minus N1 is the natural rate of unemployment. Now this view about the natural rate of unemployment was first put forward by monetarist economists, and the US economist Milton Friedman was at the heart of this school of thought, and he influenced policy quite seriously in the 1970s and 1980s. And this view has quite actually become quite powerful in the thinking on unemployment. But it's important to note the use of the word natural rate. What does it mean when you say the natural rate of unemployment? What is so natural about this rate? And that's exactly what the monetarist economists said. They said that there is a level of activity in the economy or level of employment in the economy beyond which you cannot hire more people. That is, no matter how fully employed the resources of the economy are, there will always be certain people who will not be employed due to structural reasons, frictional reasons, seasonal reasons. We'll discuss the exact reasons later on in detail. But he said that there are reasons why the total number of people employed will not be equal to the total size of the labor force. And therefore he introduced the concept of the natural rate. That is, that this is the rate of unemployment, EF, that economists don't need to worry about. This is a natural rate, a normal rate of unemployment for a well-functioning economy. Now this is a pretty powerful concept and quite different from the views held by the classical and Keynesian schools of thought. Let's actually do a little recap of what those two schools were and then come back to the natural rate theory. Let's start with the classical economists who subscribe to the real wage theory of unemployment. Let's look at a slide for this. Now, using the same graph that we introduced earlier, that is with the AJ, LF and LD curves, we can illustrate how classical economists viewed the problem of unemployment. Basically, what classical economists said was that the equilibrium wage rate for this particular economy is W star. But wage rigidities, that is downward wage stickiness, prevents the wage rate from falling from W1 to W star. And therefore at W1 there is unemployment of AB, where B is the vertical point above the equilibrium that would have existed if the wage rate had fallen to W star. So the difference between N star and N1, that is AB, is the measure of the classical or real wage unemployment as viewed by classical economists. Now, I don't want to repeat the reasons for downward wage rigidity that the classical economists gave. If you remember, these were the existence of trade unions which negotiate a higher wage rate than what the full employment level warrants. It included the existence of unemployment benefits which discouraged people from offering themselves on the labor market, and it included minimum wages set by government. That is, the government could pass legislation not allowing the wage rate to fall below a subsistence level. All these reasons were cited by classical economists as impediments to solving the unemployment problem, the real wage unemployment problem. So the solutions that they presented were also linked to their identification of the cause. So they said, if you want this problem to go away, then reduce the power of trade unions, labor unions. But then this is sometimes not politically feasible. Often labor and trade unions are politically quite active and they often hold the reins of government in their hands. So it's sometimes not politically feasible to that. Then classical economists said remove minimum wages. That is, remove the minimum wage floor, that ceiling that the government has, floor that the government has set. right? But this again might hurt the poorest part of the population the most. Note that if the minimum wage floor was removed, then it would be to the detriment of the poorest people, because it's the poorest people who are on that minimum wage level who would suffer most, because their minimum wages would then fall. Similarly, if the minimum wage or generally the wage rate in the economy fell, then it would hurt the production of goods and services in society, because as people's wage rates fall, they will be able to consume less, and firms will look at this and then produce less, and when they produce less, this would have a negative effect on labor demand. And this is actually where the Keynesian view of unemployment comes in. Now, if you remember, Keynes's view of unemployment was one of demand-deficient unemployment. He noted that the key problem that was leading people to remain unemployed was the lack of demand in the economy, because the lack of demand caused people to be able to purchase less goods and services, and that was an indicator for firms to produce less, and when firms decided to produce less, they hired less labor, and that sort of accentuated the unemployment problem. Let's briefly revisit the graph that can help illustrate this, and then we will come back to the implications, the policy implications of the Keynesian standpoint. Now, Keynes's view can be highlighted by looking at this labor market where you start from point D. That is, this is the optimal point where the wage star and the N star represent the natural rate or full rate of employment and wages. Now, what happens when there is deficient demand, that is, demand falls, and the LD curve, the labor demand curve, shifts from LD to LD1? This will cause the new equilibrium wage rate to fall from W star to W1. However, Keynes's view was that this problem would simply not be solved by letting the wage rate fall to W1, right? Remember that this is exactly what the classical economists had suggested, that is, to allow the wage rate to fall from W star to W1. But Keynes's insight was that when you move to W1, that is, when wages fall to W1, this has a negative effect on firms' demand for labor. Because firms now see people making fewer money, fewer salaries, they now expect to sell less goods in the future, and therefore they will move to a lower level of production, which in turn will lower the demand for labor from LD1 to LD2. So you would move first from point D to point E, then to point F. So the wage rate at any time would be higher than the wage rate required to clear the market. So for example, when the economy has moved to E, the new equilibrium would have to be struck at F. So the wage rate would be stuck at W1. And then to what extent would classical economists argue that the wage rate should be reduced or continually reduced? Note that in moving from W star to W1 to W2, we are not moving towards equilibrium. We are moving away from the full employment level N star. First we move to N1, then we move to N2. That means the recession or the problem of unemployment is becoming worse. Now, if you remember, Keynes wanted the problem of unemployment to be solved by demand management policies. That is, by pumping or injecting demand into the economy. He saw that there was a lot of slack in the economy. There were a lot of idle productive resources which could be usefully employed or deployed, and therefore he argued for expansionary fiscal policy, that is, the government increasing its spending or reducing its taxation levels. So clearly the policies that Keynes suggested for tackling the unemployment problem were very different from what the classical economists suggested. Now, the problem with Keynes's policies, demand management policies, was that sometimes when you increase aggregate demand and there is not enough slack in the economy, then, and if you are on the upward sloping part of the aggregate supply curve, then any increase in aggregate demand can also push prices up. So you can confront the problem of inflation in trying to solve the problem of unemployment. So this was a major concern and became a major concern in the 1970s and 80s. Also, sometimes an increase in aggregate demand can cause economies to develop balance of payments problems. When aggregate demand increases, expenditure on imports rises, and when expenditure on imports rises, the import expenditure can exceed your export revenues and therefore cause a crisis of foreign exchange. That is, you might not have enough foreign exchange to finance those additional import expenditures. So these were some of the problems that Keynesian solutions to the unemployment problem or the demand management way of solving the problem came or brought forward. Now, with that understanding of classical and Keynesian positions on unemployment, we can now move to the earlier discussion on the natural rate of unemployment, that is the monetarist view of unemployment. Now, monetarism was basically concerned with increasing the natural rate of employment, that is increasing or reducing the natural rate of unemployment by bringing the AJ and the LF curves closer together. Remember that EF, which we defined as the natural rate of unemployment in our earlier graph, was the horizontal difference or the horizontal distance between the AJ and the LF curves. And the monetarist economists said that the focus of policymakers should be on trying to reduce this gap. And they suggested many possible ways in which this could be done. But in order to do that, we first needed to understand what were the reasons for the AJ and LF curves to be separate. Remember earlier we said that it is possible for people to be members of the labor force but not be willing to or not be in a position to accept the jobs that were offered. So why could this be, or how could this come about? How could people be on the labor force and yet not in a position to accept jobs? Here we introduce the three concepts of frictional, structural, and seasonal unemployment. And all of these are reasons for why the AJ curve is left of the LF curve. That is, why is there a horizontal distance between the two? Let's look at these three concepts individually. Now, who are frictionally unemployed people? Frictionally unemployed people are those people who are hopping between jobs. That is, who are still searching for their next job. They were in a job, then they were laid off, and now they are searching for another job. And the delays that are caused by the search process is responsible for keeping people unemployed for some time. Now, why would people take time in searching for a job? There could be two reasons. One is related to information. Employers who are looking to hire people do not have perfect information on which person is the best person for a particular job. Interview processes take time, etc., etc. Similarly, the person who wants to become employed, right, the searcher himself might not be immediately able to decide which job is best for him or her. So he or she might decide to wait a little bit longer to look at all the different options and then choose the job which is best or which offers the higher wage. Because if you make an early decision, a rushed decision, you might end up locking yourself in a job which does not pay you a lot, right? So there is this trade-off between waiting and trying to get a higher paying job. On the other hand, the more you wait for a new job, the more anxious you might get, right? Because your unemployment spell becomes longer and longer, and therefore your willingness to accept a lower job might be increasing. So while your chances of getting a job which pays you higher increase as your unemployment spell becomes longer, your willingness to accept a job which offers you a lower pay increases. And the combination of these two causes the delay, the unemployment period or the spell which an average searcher might confront. Let's illustrate this through a simple graph. Now in this economy, we plot the wage rate on the vertical axis and the length of time unemployed or the duration of unemployment on the horizontal axis. Note the two lines, the W0 line and the WA line. The W0 line captures the chances of getting a better job as you wait longer. So as the time or length of unemployment increases, your chances of finding a better or more paying job increase. Whereas if you look at the other line, WA line, that represents the line that shows that workers or potential workers will become more and more desperate and more anxious to get a job as the time increases. It is the intersection of those two curves which will determine the average duration or average length or spell of unemployment. Now, the policy recommendation of sort of relating to dealing with the problem of frictional or search unemployment was obviously to increase the information available to both searchers, job searchers, and firms looking for workers. And the information could be increased by setting up job centers, by increasing the advertisements appearing in newspapers, policies like that. What is the other type of unemployment that can explain the difference between the, or distance between the AJ and LF curves? And that is structural unemployment. Now, structural unemployment arises when there are structural changes in an economy. How could this happen? Well, think of what happens when the demand patterns change in any economy. So think of people suddenly preferring a certain product and not liking a certain product. Well, the product that they don't like anymore, the people who were involved in the production of that product will be laid off, right? Whereas the people who are now being hired are those which are producing the product which the general public likes. Now, demand changes can be caused by changes in competition, by changes in tastes, by a number of other changes. It is also possible for people to be left structurally unemployed, that is, with a set of skills that does not match the available jobs, when the technology of production changes in the economy. So think about what the computer has done to the publishing industry. Remember earlier there were people with very nice handwriting who used to, the katib कहते थे उनको, वो लिखते थे उर्दू में, और उनकी handwriting, उनकी लिखाई की वजह से उनको बहुत सारा काम मिलता था. Now that entire industry has been shut down because of the advent of the computer, the personal computer, which has formed the function that Katib was doing into a program called Katib, right? So now you can just sort of key in on the keyboard and you will get very nicely typed Urdu or English typed versions. So these jobs have, the people who have been made redundant is because of changes in technology. Also, when certain capital intensive techniques are adopted by firms, then laborers might be laid off. So for example, if a firm, a cotton producing firm or a cloth producing firm was using looms which require a lot of laborers, and suddenly it moves to a loom, a new technology which uses less laborers, then the laborers who will be laid off or made redundant is simply because of a change in technology. Now, structural unemployment can also arise because the industries or the businesses in a particular region might shut down. This could be because of natural disasters. There could be a flood which sort of ruins all the factories there. So factors which have regional impacts, which leave people stranded in a particular region where there are no jobs, can also lead people to remain unemployed. Now, how can you solve the problem of structural unemployment? Well, the obvious solution is to have more training programs which enable people to shift their skill set. So the people who were very good, had very good handwritings, the katibs, who earlier had jobs of writing and had jobs in publishing, the publishing industry, must now be trained to use the computer and do the same thing. So you need to make people's skill acquiring attitudes more flexible. People should be more willing to change their skill set. Often this happens when you have people working in mines or the minerals industry, and once the mines are shut, they don't have anywhere to go. So it's worth the government's while to invest in the training of those individuals so that they can take on other jobs. Also, when you have regionally caused unemployment, then it might be possible to reduce the cost of shifting from one city to another city to take on the jobs which are available in the other city. So this would happen, or this would be the optimal policy when the costs of transport or cost of shifting from one region where there is a lot of unemployment to another region where there are job opportunities, when this cost of shifting is high between these two cities. Now it is also possible for people to be seasonally unemployed. That is, that they might have jobs in a particular season and they might not have jobs when the season changes. So think of a place where only mangoes are grown. Now that a place would create a lot of jobs in the summers, but once the summers end and the mango crop expires, then there are no jobs for the people who are employed there. Seasonal unemployment is a big problem in countries where the climate changes or the weather changes are quite sharp. So where जहाँ बर्फबारी बहुत होती है, तो अगर बर्फ ही पड़ रही है तो कोई किसी किस्म का काम जो है वो हो नहीं सकता, रुक जाता है. So when activity depends on the weather, then seasonal unemployment can be quite an important problem. The solutions to this type of problem are not so obvious. Generally, the government would like to ensure that even when the season changes, some industry or some kind of business activity can be continued in the new season. Now, all these policies that we've been talking about are attempting to bridge the gap between the AJ curve and the LF curve, and this will help reduce the natural rate of unemployment. All these policies are categorized as supply-side policies. And one supply-side policy which has caught a lot of attention is when you reduce the income tax rate that is charged on the wages that people earn. Note that the income tax rate, the marginal income tax rate, measures the amount of money that people would have to pay to the government on what they earn from their jobs. So if you increase the marginal income tax rate, that is the amount of the extra dollar that you will earn that will go to the government, if you increase this rate, people will have a disincentive, a greater disincentive to work. They will not be encouraged to make that extra dollar because a large part of that is going to the government. Let's illustrate this through a simple slide. Now looking at the similar setup, we have real wage on the vertical axis and the number of workers on the horizontal axis. We can see how an income tax makes the net of tax wage received by households lower than the gross wage paid by firms. AB measures the amount each worker pays in income tax, and equilibrium employment is N1, the quantity that households wish to supply at the after-tax wage W3 and that firms demand at the gross wage W1. At the after-tax wage rate W3, the natural rate of unemployment is BC. If the income tax were abolished, equilibrium would be at point E and employment would rise from N1 to N2, and the natural rate of unemployment would fall from BC to EF. So as you can see, my friends, the solution that you suggest for solving the problem of unemployment depends critically on which school of thought you belong to. What is, in your estimation, the cause of the problem? If you are a Keynesian, then you would go for Keynesian demand solutions. If you are a classical economist, then you would go for classical solutions. And if you are a monetarist who believe in the natural theory of unemployment, natural rate of unemployment, then you would go for supply-side policies. Now, there is one small item left in the topic of unemployment, which is that of hysteresis, which is a way of explaining persistence in unemployment, which we will cover in our next lecture before we move to a discussion of inflation. So, my friends, with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. We've covered a lot of ground today. We started by looking at the meaning of unemployment. We looked at the costs of unemployment, the private and social costs. We developed theories about the possible causes of unemployment. We looked at the different solutions that would be warranted if you sort of subscribe to these different theories. So we looked at Keynesian solutions, classical solutions, supply-side solutions. We will conclude our discussion of unemployment in our next lecture and then move to a systematic tackling of the problem of inflation. Till then, it is Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu alaikum.